morning. It's really a pleasure to be here. I've followed the work that, Bernie and CRL have been doing for many years, and it's really wonderful to be able to speak to this organization about these issues, because I think CRL has really been doing some of the best thinking in this area for a while. And I think the sort of fundamental theme that I'm going to try and lay out for you, which is that the digital world really demands a fundamental rethinking of a number of things, will be very resonant with the program that CRL has been pursuing. So let me just dive straight in. I have spent much of the last decade thinking about what Stewardship for scholarly communication, for government, for commerce, for just communication among people. I think of stewardship in this context as really dealing with two things. One is taking the legacy of the past forward, and the other is capturing a sense of the present time for the future. And I guess I've come to believe in recent years that we're going to have to think very differently about the environment we're moving into. Stewardship interventions are going to have to take place at very different points in the life cycles of information, and they're going to have to, in some cases, be much more active. It's very striking to me that, once upon a time, we acquired artifacts, purchased them, or otherwise collected them, and then took care of them. Then we started moving into more active measures. For example, crawling the web in various thematic ways to try and capture activity there. And now I think we face a demand to really sort of actively document what's taking place in a much more sort of aggressive fashion if we're going to bring that sense of the present into the future. This raises some very interesting questions, by the way, about both the nature of the record of the present and how limited it really is going to inevitably be. It's always been limited, but it's going to be limited in some new ways. And it also raises some questions that I'll return to at the end of my remarks about professions and roles and responsibilities, which I think are also interesting. So let's just look at a couple of things that are happening out there right now. So one thing that's happened as we look at the digital world is that personalization has become absolutely pervasive. You really may underestimate how pervasive it's become. I'll just share one anecdote from back in the last presidential administration, where I know a few folks were looking at how they could capture government information, and they were looking at crawling the whitehouse.gov website. And two people sitting, across the room from each other went over there, and they suddenly realized they were seeing different sites because it was personalizing the site to their interests. Think about the news. Think, online newspapers, if you will, although that's such a weird phrase, news sites. Now, if you had asked me 5, 7 years ago, how would you document the news online? How would you capture that? I would have said, well, Okay, the problem is you need to get the underlying database that sits behind something like the New York Times online. And if you could just capture that, you'd be fine. I don't think that's really true anymore, because if you think about the impact and the way news works online, it's very customized to who the site thinks you are, and there are lots of facets to that. There may be some demographic facets to that. It may think it knows where you are geographically, a bunch of other things. And perhaps also your past history of interactions with the site and the interests you've expressed and the things you've clicked on. So really, to understand what the site is communicating to the public broadly, you need to understand not only what's in the database sitting behind the site, but the choices it makes in presenting things. If you just capture the database, you're really missing a whole dimension of what's the impact of this website. The fact that there's some article in there that it wasn't showing to anybody and that maybe, a handful of people could find with a very targeted search, and that this other article was getting shown to everybody, really makes a big difference. So all of a sudden now we have to be able to understand not just what this site could potentially show you, but the choices it was making in terms of what it was showing to people. A particularly startling example of this, of course, is what happened with social media, which we're frankly still trying to really get our hands around with regard to a number of elections around the world, including the last US presidential election, where we saw highly audience-targeted material getting delivered to particular demographics, and really understanding who was seeing what, when, is an enormously hard problem, but one that, as you all know, if you've been following the news, is turning out to be really critical to understanding recent history, politics, and international relations, and is clearly going to be of interest to scholars far into the future. There are a couple of other things that are starting to happen at scale as we look around the digital world. One is things that I would describe as black box algorithms. And we see these in lots of settings now, and they're attracting quite a bit of attention from people who are concerned with biases and other things that may be built into these algorithms. These are things that make recommendations or decisions, things like deciding whether you should get a loan, making recommendations to courts about sentencing or about bail. They make their decisions in opaque ways based on opaque inputs. And yet, these are potentially high-stakes things in many cases. We'd really like to be able to understand and document the choices they make. Now, in some cases, for example, in the applications that I just described within the criminal justice system, I would certainly think that there would be a powerful social interest in actually documenting every choice made. I mean, I would also argue that there would be a powerful social interest in transparency in the black box. In other words, making very clear what the algorithm is doing, but Apparently, much of the world doesn't agree with me because we see these proprietary algorithms still being used in these situations. And don't underestimate, by the way, how pervasive these things are. I mentioned the criminal justice system. I mentioned various financial and credit granting applications, but these things are popping up in lots of other places, like assigning children to school districts and specific schools. And we're going to see more and more of this. So we'd like to understand what these do. And then let me just give you one other example, machine learning algorithms. Now, I want to very carefully scope this. There's been a lot of silly talk about artificial intelligence lately taking over the world and like that. And I don't buy a lot of that, but what has happened is we've seen some massive advances in machine learning techniques. Basically, what these are about is recognizing patterns or occasionally creating things that match certain kinds of patterns. So they're very good at, for example, playing games. They're very good at doing things like recognizing images and things in images, recognizing speech, this sort of thing. The problem is that the way these work is you essentially train these neural networks. And I don't want to get into all the details here, but basically you're feeding these things a lot of training data, and they learn to recognize things. The problem is we don't know how they work usually. Basically, you've got this very complicated neural network, and what it's actually doing is anybody's guess. They don't know how to explain themselves, and often they're very brittle, or they're doing things that are quite unpredictable. There have been lots and lots of efforts to train these neural networks to look for specific things, to recognize dogs in pictures or horses or things like that. And often you find that they're cueing in on different things in the picture than a human would in order to make these recognitions, and occasionally make hilarious mistakes when you feed them things. Well, sometimes they're hilarious, sometimes they're just appalling mistakes when you feed them things that aren't part of their training set. While there's a lot of research going on right now in trying to develop machine learning techniques that actually can explain what they're doing, this is a very hard research problem, and I'm not exceedingly optimistic it's going to get solved real soon. So this is clearly another situation where we'd really like to document these things that we actually don't really know how to record or capture, or in that case, even understand. So this is the digital world that we're operating in right now. It's a world where if you really think hard about what's going on, essentially every interaction with this digital world is a personalized one-off performance based on who it thinks you are, and I stress who it thinks you are because it's often confused. You've probably encountered that occasionally where some site you're interacting with seems to have decided you have drastically different demographics than you do and have very different interests, and starts showing you some really strange advertising. That happens. But basically, it's a personalized performance based on your past history, what else is going on in the world, which involves perhaps your social network, and perhaps more. Think about trending news, where it's basically averaging over the entire population in order to figure out what's trending. does it mean to try and capture a sense of this present and take it into the future? This is a very uneasy question. This is light years away from the notion of a canonical artifact like a published book and taking that into the future. What do? We obviously, it's insane to think about, well, we're going to capture every performance. Not going to happen. I mean, maybe we capture every performance in some very constrained things like the judicial decision-making transactions that I was describing earlier. But in the sort of broader sphere of current culture, clearly we can't do that. So what do? Well, here's the best I've been able to come up with as I think about this problem. We can try and capture what I might characterize as the dominant audience segments. And there are a couple ways we can do it, but let me say a couple things about dominant audience segments. Some of you might recall a thing that the Wall Street Journal, I believe, did back in the 2016 election, where they had a thing called Red Facebook, Blue Facebook, where they got a couple of volunteers, one who was sort of an archetypal blue person and another was a sort of an archetypal red person, and then they compared the stuff that showed up in their news feeds and wrote a series of articles and online postings about it so that you got some insight into how different those two worlds of news feeds were. Except that, as we know now, particularly after all of the issues around Facebook and the 2016 election has come to light, they slice and dice the audience a lot more finely than red and blue. They dice it into people who are, in certain demographic categories, certain geographical categories, that have pets, that have interests, in certain kinds of hobbies, that follow certain religions, that have expressed affinity with certain things. It's actually fairly startling if you start looking at the number of categories and the precision, the incredible precision with which advertisers or other entities can target material and can fine-tune the delivery of material to certain demographics. So what we really need to think about is what are the key demographics that we'd like to capture? Clearly, if systems are personalizing to different segments, there've got to be some dominant clusters, and these will be different for different systems and perhaps for different research interests, but we need to start figuring these out empirically or otherwise, and then start capturing sample transactions out of these particular demographic subcategories. There are two ways we can do this technically, and both of them have abundant problems. But so far, nobody seems to have a much better idea. One way is to create fake users with various kinds of demographic profiles and then have them log on to these systems and collect interactions and news feeds and things like that. Now, here's the trouble with this. So you'd think, on kind of an initial, approximation to this, if you create a user ID on, let's say, Facebook, a new user ID, and start setting up the profile and start developing a history of interaction on that you'd be set. Except that you wouldn't, because Facebook actually does a regular trade with a huge number of data brokers to collect background information about its users. Various mysterious companies like Axiom. If you're ever, really want to dive into this, I'd invite you to look at the Axiom data catalog, which I found online, with the hundreds and hundreds of attributes it collects about people all over the world and will resell, to other folks. So really, Facebook knows what you tell it and then what it bought from other data brokers. So unless you've got a good way of falsifying records for these fake, identities that are capturing information in these other data brokers, you're going to have a problem really setting up robust identities. I will leave aside the small matter that setting up these kind of fake identities for capturing and archiving violate all the terms and conditions of using most of these social systems. That's a detail, but an important one. I'm sort of trying to look at how to solve the problem rather than how to, or not solve the problem, but at least make some progress rather than all of the legal details. The other thing you can do, besides setting up these robots to record, is you could recruit a cadre of witnesses that represent the right demographics. Interesting issue. Now, can you really effectively recruit such a cadre of witnesses with the right demographic distribution? Will they cooperate? If you're trying to find, conspiracy theorists, can you actually get some of them to come on board to help contribute to the collective cultural record you're trying to capture here? Highly untested at this point, but that's the other way forward. And you actually recruit witnesses who are real people who have a history in the various identity systems and credit bureaus and things like that. Now, it's probably worth just briefly making a very strong contrast here between this kind of activity, which is about capturing the behavior of these large-scale systems at some sort of scale, and personal self-archiving. There are tools, for example, in most social media systems now that let you say, tell me all the things I've told you about myself. Give me a copy of my history. So you can get that from Facebook, you could get that from lots of other sites. And you could preserve that, but that's an individual, single person kind of decision. And unless we start doing that at huge scale, which I don't see happening, we really aren't going to capture this kind of sense of what these very pervasive, but at the same time highly personalized systems are telling us as a culture right now. So let me just highlight, how little we know here. So we don't really have an understanding of the demographics here. We don't know how many groups or witnesses we'd need to capture for various systems in order to get some handle on the majority of their behavior. We don't understand much about costs. We don't understand the sort of curatorial stability of this. Just because you do a one-off analysis and say, these are the demographics and the behavior of the system that it looks like today, how long is that good for? Do you need to redo that once a year, once a month? How stable are the various algorithms that are doing the personalization or delivering the personalized advertising or other information? And then there's the question of how do we interpret what's captured? Imagine you're a scholar 20 years from now, and you're trying to understand the role of information operations in the 2016 election. Imagine you were lucky enough to have a few hundred or a few thousand feeds that have the kind of demographic spread that I just described. How would you find your way through that massive data and interpret it? Very, very untested waters here. Scholars have little experience with this. I mean, again, if you look at the 2016 election, which has been heavily scrutinized from various perspectives, you see Facebook making available, 6,000 ads that were delivered by what they think are, foreign affiliated groups to various demographics. They are saying a few things about the demographics of who they were delivered to. It's clear that there were hundreds of thousands of people involved. What does a scholar actually do with that kind of data? It's really a very different and alien kind of a world, and it remains to be proven that we can design effective tools to navigate this. It's a little bit reminiscent of what's happening now with the huge document dumps that are occurring, things like the Panama Papers or the Snowden files, where all of a sudden you get hundreds of thousands of documents, email messages, whatever, of dubious provenance. You don't know whether they're complete, whether there are some fabrications mixed in, what's been omitted, and you're trying to navigate through this. So I think we need, as we face up to this reality, we also need to be very mindful that there needs to be a continuing active dialogue with the scholars who are going to try and use this material about what indeed is actually useful. Now, I've already gone on a little longer than I intended. This is a rich area, and I could go on for a long time. But I just want to conclude with a couple of minutes worth of observation about professional roles and things like that. So I just described a set of scenarios where, as we look at a very highly personalized and interactive world of online information that we want to capture a sense of, we're going to have to take rather active curatorial measures. We're going to have to make choices about demographics and actually go out and capture material. This is very alien in a certain sense to the ethos of archivists, librarians, and similar folks. They have historically largely thought in terms of, I have an artifact, and now I need to take care of it, I need to preserve it, I need to organize it, I need to bring it into the future. That's quite different than saying, let's go out and document the present. Indeed, the kind of work I'm describing might fit more comfortably in the tradition of videographers, journalism, ethnographers, documentary filmmakers, those sorts of folks. And really, the role of archives or libraries in that sense is they wait for the journalists or the documentary filmmakers or the videographers or the ethnographers to create artifacts, and then they bring them into the future. They don't create the artifacts themselves. So I think there is a very interesting open question about who genuinely is going to do the active work of documenting this world of highly personalized digital information and how it finds its way to our traditional I don't know what the answer is to that, but I think it's something that definitely demands some reflection. And I've had some very interesting conversations with some folks in the archival community about this who simultaneously admit, yeah, this is very alien to what they do, but they're very uncomfortable, and on the other hand saying, well, we're going to take this sort of more passive role and let somebody else do the actual documenting. So I hope that in these comments I've at least shed some light on the changing nature of this world and just how different and strange it is compared to what we're used to. And how it really, if we are going to preserve a sense of the present and bring it into the future, demands some very, very different thinking about roles, tactics, and even what's possible as we address the stewardship challenge here. Thank you. And I'd love a few questions if we have time.
Rachel Breckus, Humanities Librarian, Social Science Librarian at University of Missouri. Methodologically, if somebody like me, because I'm the history and the sociology librarian, if somebody like me were to recruit a cadre of people, what do you have a sense methodologically of how to go about, and how sort of far out the web to go and capture?
I don't have a good sense of that, and I've looked around trying to find information about that, and it seems to be a not particularly well-studied problem. I mean, there is lots of there's lots of knowledge, much of it not terrifically well codified in the scholarly literature, as far as I can tell, about how wide to cast the net for certain kinds of polling and opinion collection. But I'm a little bit uneasy about taking that body of knowledge and trying to move it over. It's certainly a place to start, but the ways in which these various personalization algorithms slice and dice the audience may be quite different from the way that, for example, political polling needs to slice and dice a sample. So I think there's a huge area for research in here. I can tell, there's an interesting history, which I have looked into a little bit, of how they essentially created and then subdivided audiences to sell to advertisers. Once upon a time, there were only like 3 TV stations, typically, for most of the country, and they sold the audience essentially in a couple of segments. One was the day segment, which was presumed to be housewives, and then the evening segment, which was presumed to be the whole family. And then as more channels came along and they developed better systems for tracking what people are watching, they started attaching demographics to shows and things like that. There are, a whole series of various kinds of advertiser targeting things that developed from the really 1940s or 50s onwards, getting ever more refined. The most elaborate of those I've seen, until the kind of digital explosion, really only segmented into maybe like 60 sub-audiences, something like that. So I think there's a ton of work to be done here, and certainly there are a number of research specialties around advertising, political science, polling, things like that, that could shed light here.
Hi, Cliff. Jeff Kosakoff, Duke University. A lot of what we heard yesterday and today was about how the privacy Pandora's box has been opened, and as you described, put behind a wall we can't see. And I wonder, that's a problem that exists now, and documenting how now works is great, but I think a lot of us feel like we need to fix something. And I wonder if you could talk about what we would fix, how we would go about doing it, what the likely avenues are for us as activists to try to open the black box or know what's in it or something.
Okay. I mean, there are a lot of people working on that who, are far more knowledgeable than I am. It's actually kind of interesting because when I started looking into this area a couple of years ago, I found a number of people coming at this from a, sort of a social justice or related point of view, trying to understand in particular biases in algorithms. There has been some fascinating work done, for example, on those judicial sentencing recommendation things that I was describing, trying to understand whether there is various kinds of racial or class bias in the recommendations coming out of those. So there's been quite a lot of work done on that, and some good methodological work, in fact, trying to analyze some of this. But it was striking to me that there was almost no work done in trying to just kind of capture the now as opposed to analyze it for particular bad behaviors. Furthermore, there are a lot of things that I would suspect don't rise to the level of, demanding regulation necessarily or other kinds of things, but are still worth understanding. So if I have a system that gives me a bad, recommendation for a book or shows me a couple of news articles I'm not terribly interested in, that's not necessarily a major legal or political or social crisis. It's just, it's not working very well. But it would still be useful to understand what these things are doing. So first off, I want to just kind of draw the distinction between the two objectives. They're very different. Now, I would say personally that for things that have high stakes, certainly anything having to do with the public sphere, like the criminal justice system or assigning people to schools or something like that, there is no place for black boxes. That code needs to be open and subject to wide scrutiny, and the decisions also need to be carefully recorded and probably made available to the extent that they can be made available en masse while preserving the privacy of individuals for subsequent reanalysis by anybody who's interested. I really get terribly uncomfortable with black boxes in that context. Now, going beyond that, I think it is unavoidable to recognize that this machine learning technology is very powerful and very useful. And simply saying, well, we're not going to, allow it because we can't understand what it's doing, is probably unreasonable. At the same time, I think that they need to be very careful about where they deploy it. I'm thinking, face recognition systems that are part of the national security or law enforcement apparatus. There are lots of examples of that kind of thing. Weapons targeting, I would be kind of careful about when you deploy this and recognize the fragility of it. It's interesting, the European General Data Protection Regulations, which some of you have probably been reading about, basically try to heavily restrict the use of algorithms that can't explain themselves in various settings. And we'll see how that works out. I'm not real optimistic that it's going to end well. So those are a few thoughts on that. Okay.
Julie Sweet-Kindsinger at Stanford University. I wonder about a third option of capturing this kind of content that you didn't mention. So you gave the Facebook issue around the fake user or the getting somebody to agree. But what about working directly with the companies to get aggregated data from certain segments that they're focusing on? So is there any option, be it them or LinkedIn or Twitter, to say, we're looking for an aggregated segment of this area, and can we get feeds? I don't know if they would ever agree to that or their privacy would, but it made me think, are we not looking at what the producers might be able to provide for long-term preservation?
That is a wonderful question and well worth asking. So far, from what I can tell, most of the people who are doing this have no interest in cooperating. In fact, many of them are actively uncooperative. Now, Twitter is probably the, I don't want to say exception, but they at least have, they make feeds available. And a lot of what happens in Twitter is very kind of explicitly public, if you will. But almost all the other players are pretty uncooperative. It would be much better if you could really develop a meaningful partnership with some of the major players here. But I wish I could be optimistic about it. The other thing that I just want to call out is the scale issue. You start thinking about you said it exactly right. What you want is an aggregated, boiled down, set of feeds. Even if, Mark Zuckerberg said, sure, we're going to give you a feed into all the public or semi-public Facebook stuff, you can't imagine, nor can you get the kind of computational and storage capacity necessary to accept that feed, even if the lawyers would let you. Thanks so much.